Good afternoon or good evening. Hi. I'm Carol Richardson, the Museum Coordinator for A. Quinn Jones Museum and Cultural Center. Thank you so much for being with us today for our community book launch. We are very pleased to have this partnership with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. This is the second of many book launches that we've done with them, and we're just really excited. The A. Quinn Jones Museum and Cultural Center is owned by the City of Gainesville's Department of Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Affairs, and is in honor of a pioneering educator, Mr. A. Quinn Jones, who taught in the Alachua County school system for over 50 years. So we're really pleased and excited that the city has renovated this space so that we can be able to host many cultural programs for the community. With that, I'd like to ask you, before you leave, if you could fill out this survey. I know you might hate it, but front and back, let us know how we're doing, if you like programs like this, how we can improve. We do take it to heart. In addition to this, starting in June, we have a new exhibition opening called Pioneers of Blues. They're in their progeny, basically talking about the history of blues music. We're going to have some great art from a world-class artist that's going to be installing a new exhibition. We also do live music on our patio. When you leave today, if you take a look around the museum, check out some of the exhibition, and also take a look back on the back patio. You can have some snacks and refreshments. So with that, thank you so very much for spending your time with us. Thank you, Mr. Felder, for sharing what is going to be wonderful information. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Mr. Dr. Paul Ortiz, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. It's always an honor to be able to work with Carol Richardson. Carol and I have done a number of events together, most recently the book launch for the 50th anniversary of African American Studies at the University of Florida. And that was such a great event, we decided to do it again. And so the book that we're here tonight to talk about, Discovering A.S.J. Allen by Alonzo Felder, well, I'm not going to do any plot spoilers because Alonzo is going to tell you all about the book in a few moments. But it's my great honor, before I introduce Alonzo, to be able to introduce another dear friend who I've known for many years. Some of you had the great fortune of attending the Florida Historical Society and the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society annual meeting just a few days ago, which was held here in Gainesville. The success of that event owes so much to Dr. Ben Brotemarkle, who is the executive director of the Florida Historical Society. And when I asked Ben if he would come and say a few words tonight, I didn't realize he was going to have to drive all the way back down home and then drive all the way back up here today. Now, after an exhausting weeks of preparing for a conference, an exhausting 3-day conference, this man is a history hero. So let's a round of applause for Dr. Ben Brotemarkle. I do want to say a few words. As you know, he is the executive director of the Florida Historical Society, which is the oldest existing cultural organization in the state. And the society does so many good things for Florida history. And I'm so proud to be a board member of the society. I owe Ben an apology because I missed our last board meeting. I'm sorry, Ben, I'll say it publicly. But he really keeps the ship running. And the Florida Historical Society does so many great things. How many people listen to Florida Frontiers, right? How many people read the Florida Historical Quarterly? How many people have the opportunity to attend one of our many history programs? Ben is really the spark plug. There's a lot of great staff people, a lot of great scholars, a lot of great volunteers. But the reason that we all kind of stick to the society, I think, is because of this gentleman here. So I'm going to ask him to come forward now and say a few words for us. And again, we're honored by your presence. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I'm very happy to be here and would not miss it. It was well worth the drive back up. I first heard about the story of A.S.J. Allen from Paul, and it was a powerful story, a tragic story, which Alonzo will tell you all about. But at that time, Paul also told me that Alonzo Felder, the great-grandson of A.S.J. Allen, had a book about his ancestor. And so Alonzo and I started corresponding, talking on the phone, by email, and I encouraged him to send me the manuscript. Well, the first manuscript he sent me was 86 pages long. And this was compelling. It was compelling writing. I knew we wanted to publish this book, but 86 pages isn't a book. So I told Alonzo this, and you know, I was a little bit nervous about it because I didn't want to discourage him. And so he very correctly, you know, asked, well, how much do you need? And I didn't want to, like I said, I didn't want to discourage him, so I didn't want to say 300 pages or 400 pages. So I said, well, let's shoot for 200 pages. And he, I didn't know if that 86 pages was all he had or not. So he said, oh yes, I cut a lot of stuff and I can put it back in and we'll be fine. So I felt relieved, but I was still expecting about 200 pages probably. And after a short period of time, he sent me his revived manuscript, and I had no cause for worry because he sent me 500 pages of manuscript. So, and it was much closer to the book that you see here tonight. And it is a compelling story. It's different from anything the Florida Historical Society Press has published before. We publish about between 5 and 10 books a year, so we have to be picky. We have to really choose what we're going to publish, and this was a compelling story that I knew we wanted to publish. But it's really kind of, there's 3 aspects to the book. There's the story of A.S.J. Allen, which is kind of a thread that runs throughout the book. There's the story of Alonzo doing his research and a journey of self-discovery that he goes through, and what he learned while doing it. Then there's the aspect of helping other people to do their own research. And he does this not only through the example of what he did, researching A.S.J. Allen, there is that model, but he also has practical advice for other ways that you can do the research for your ancestry. So there's all of these different sides to the book, and it just is really a very special book. And I want to thank Paul for letting me know about the story and about Alonzo. I want to thank Alonzo for doing such a great book. And on behalf of myself and the staff, the team at the Florida Historical Society Press, if you don't know Alonzo, he's in addition to being a good writer, he is a really nice guy. And he's a pleasure to work with. And so I'm very proud that we had a part in bringing this work to fruition. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Ben. And the moment you all have been waiting for, I have prepared a 45-minute lecture.
All right.
No, I'm just kidding. So, Alonzo, we've known each other for many, many years. And it's been one of the blessings in my life to be able to share a part of this odyssey with you as an outsider. But the thing about Alonzo, you already can kind of tell, he doesn't treat you like an outsider. He doesn't treat you like you're not a member of his family. And once you get to know him, you are a member of his family. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he has been on recently about a 3-week road trip.
Yes.
His lovely wife, Francine, is with us. Please give a round of applause to Francine, because if you know anything about the writing process, the first thing you have to know is the sacrifices, with capital S, that family members make for writers. So Francine has been the sounding board. I know she's done a lot of editing. I know she's done a lot of encouragement, so thank you for helping make this project. Without you, it wouldn't have happened.
That's right.
Alonzo and I have been in the archives together. We've done oral histories together. I'm so grateful for the fact that you've done so many oral histories with our students at the University of Florida. Those oral histories have been so impactful, Alonzo. Those students that you educated, when you told them your life history, when you told them aspects of Black history they had no idea existed, those students are now professors, they're teachers, they're business people, and they've taken that wisdom you've given them and they've applied it in their life. Alonzo, the last thing I'll mention about him, he's also the director, the founder of a wonderful organization, which I assume we'll be talking to us a little bit about.
A little bit.
Perhaps, which is all about learning your family history, My Roots Foundation. Now, I have to admit, I also missed the last board meeting that way. So now you're seeing kind of a common thread of my life, right? Anyway,
It's okay.
so without further delay, please welcome Mr. Alonzo Felder.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ben, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out to be here today. I am absolutely honored to speak before you about my great-grandfather, about Florida history, about African-American history. And I've got a slideshow here. Let's see, it's only 74 slides, so make yourself comfortable. Both Ben and Paul sort of alluded to the fact that a shortage of vocabulary or a shortage of words is not one of the problems I've ever had in life. Ben, I cut a lot to get you those 500 pages. There was a lot that's still on the floor that you haven't seen, but that's just the way it goes. We're going to talk tonight about A.S.J. Allen, the story of SKINFOK, KINFOK, and village folk. And whenever I talk about this, the first thing people ask is, well, can you kind of explain those terms? Because, we know a little bit about folks, but not necessarily all those folks. So I want to be able to explain a little bit. So we start off with SKINFOK. I think that term was most popularized by Zora Neale Hurston, who, famously said, all my skinfolk ain't kinfolk. And it's a response to a single story aspect of race, where you come into a small town, and as a black person, you meet all the white folks around, and eventually you're going to get, oh, do you know Joe? He lives over there in this part of town. And it's like, we don't know every black person on the planet. We're just because we all share the same wrapper, we honestly don't know all of us, and no, we are not related to all of us. So you have to do a little education there that, not all my skinfolk are my kinfolk. And that was very important. But then it gets confusing, because if you've ever been around a lot of African-American people and you get to know them and you start knowing their family, and there's Cousin Ben, and there's Cousin Joan, and there's Uncle Sidney over there. And after a while you're going, well, wait a minute, you do seem to have a lot of cousins. You do seem to have this family. And that all comes down to this idea of cousins and what I like to call fictive kin, fictitious kinfolk. So someone may not be a blood relative, and as I was doing my research, I discovered that a lot of the aunts and uncles that I have had in my family, and call them, my Aunt Rose. I've known her since, she's known me since before I was born. I started doing my research, and guess what I discovered? Aunt Rose is no DNA between us at all. In 1923, my grandmother and grandfather built our house that I grew up in. It was a 7-room, 2-story, 3-bathroom house, a huge place down in St. Pete. Well, that was in 23. You kind of move forward. The Depression comes along, and guess what? Our house was a rooming house, a boarding house. Aunt Rose moved into our house in the 1930s. So when I came along in 1955, Aunt Rose was a part of the family. Now, she had moved out, but it sort of helped me to understand how these cousins and fictive kin come into the picture. So I just want to be able to talk a bit about that. Now, the next bit of information that I want to give you, I'm looking at the crowd, and you know, it's good. We've got a good mix here age-wise, and I always have to do this when I talk to older people. And you know, don't be offended if I just called you older. We are talking in the book about village folk. We are not talking about these guys, okay? So let's get it out of your system if you want to, you know, sing along with me. YMCA. Okay, these are the village people. We are not talking about them. We're talking about the village folk. Think back on the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. We're talking about all those various people who may not look like you, speak the same language, or come from the same cultural background, but they are a part of your village. And when I talk about A.S.J. Allen, there were a lot of village folk who, when he was shot and killed, people came together. There were clergy, there were professionals, lawyers, there were teachers and other educators who came together and surrounded my family. And so we talk a bit about the village folk. You did it. You did it. And the question always comes up of, okay, family history, it's boring, genealogy, why? Why are you doing all this? Who cares? It's all in the past, right? No, it's not all in the past. We need to be actively involved in seeking out these people's stories. And I'm always keen, especially with my Roots Foundation, my nonprofit, to point out that I am not a professional genealogist. I like genealogy, but that's not really my thing. What I really love is family narrative. What I really want is I want to know your story. I want to know the stories of your people and how you got to be you. And it's fascinating because the stories of just common everyday people who got up in the morning, went to work, paid their taxes, did all the normal stuff, those are the people who really made us. And they're heroes. And so often they're unsung heroes. I just think that the fact that these incredible everyday men and women of our past, the fact that they lived is worthy of talking about. So it's not about the rich and the famous. It's about doing this so that we know these people lived and we acknowledge their lives. Some of you are probably already familiar with the idea of the Sankofa bird. In order, we all want to move forward. Yes, we don't want to be stuck in the past. But you notice what this little guy does? She looks back and grabs what's important as she continues to move forward. And the idea is it's okay to hold on to what's important as you're moving forward. We don't want to stop moving forward. I never want to say, oh, let's just only deal with the past. We want to look forward. We want to look at the present, but pick up what's important from the past and bring that along with you. There are so many ways to do this, and that went way too quick. There we go. So many ways to do this. I'm an IT guy, so technology has always been a part of my life. I see Emily just figured it out, what's going on there. Yes, he's blinking, he's moving. The technology exists now for us to be able to touch our ancestors in ways that just a generation before us could not. We've got so many tools for DNA discovery, for finding live relatives in our family, and yes, taking still photos and bringing them to life so that we can have that connection. Because when they're black and white pictures, they seem kind of dull and out of touch, but if you can bring them to life, that's what you want to do. And I'm really excited to just live in this time. The story of A.S.J. Allen, for me, started with Paul Ortiz, really. In one way, it started officially with me reading about him in a publication that Dr. Ortiz had published. Prior to reading that, all I knew was that picture you just saw sat on my grandmother's dresser my entire life. So growing up, it was there. Hey, Grandma, who's that? Oh, that's my daddy. Oh, where's he? Oh, we don't talk about that. And that was the end of it. We would visit every summer, and sometimes in the winter, it's Florida. Grandma would take off from St. Petersburg and come up here to Gainesville, go out to Alachua to visit with my Aunt Ella, her older sister. Guess what was on her dresser? Same picture. We would go over to my Aunt Cora's house, who lived in St. Petersburg, visit with her. Guess what was on her dresser? Same picture. My Aunt Kitty walked into the house, on the wall. It is the only photograph I have of the man, but as you'll find out when you read the book, when he was killed, he left 9 children orphaned. So 9 different households had this one picture hanging up on the wall. Francine and I just visited with some relatives down in St. Pete that I had very little contact with, told them what I was doing. My cousin runs into the back room and she comes back and guess what she's got? The same picture of Grandpa. So knowing about him is very important. I grew up with my mom, my grandmother being his youngest daughter, in St. Petersburg, Florida. Really knew nothing about my family history. In 1996, my mom passed away. In 2005, my dad passed away. I sat in my living room, I looked at my wife, and I looked at my 2 children, and I realized 2 things. Number 1, I was legitimately an orphan. I had arrived. And it was an odd kind of feeling because I just was like, I don't have anybody. And then I looked at my kids and I realized there's nobody else on the planet who shares my surname. This is the DNA that I have because my mom was an only child. I don't have any real aunts and uncles and, cousins like that. My closest cousins are my second cousins once removed, okay? And I started doing some research. I came up here to Gainesville to Mount Nebo Methodist Church Cemetery because the one thing I knew about my family is no matter where you end up in life, you take the body back to Florida. All our stuff is buried at Mount Nebo. I spent my childhood coming up here for funerals. In fact, between starting school and ending college here at the University of Florida, there were 40 different funerals. I'm from an old family. My mom was 39 when she had me. She turned 40 right after I was born. And the family is just old. Great way to grow up as an only child, by the way, with old people. You're spoiled by everybody. So I'm thankful for that blessing. But it also was a lot of trauma, obviously, with A.S.J's death, and I could get no one to talk about it. I discovered newspaper articles. This is just a transcript from one, and it kind of, I like this one because it kind of sets the mood of what I was feeling and discovering as I traveled on this journey. Both parties known here, but I love the fact that the lead here could not get full particulars. There are so many variations to what happened. Now, what's consistent? There was a boundary dispute, there was a shotgun, and there was a dead Negro. That part we got down. That's pretty consistent. But Everything else just sort of goes all over the place, and especially what I term the bias and the character assassination of the victim. I know we don't know what that looks like anymore, but it happened in 1904. That this whole idea of he was just a horrible Negro, this very offensive person, troublesome. And these are the words from the local newspapers. This is not my opinion being expressed here. They just had a heyday with blaming the victim as if, you know, he deserved it and he brought it on himself. And that affected me. It made me angry, it made me sad, but it just lit a match under me for curiosity. Because here's the thing, if this horrible person gets shot and killed, you would think, well, okay, we'll just move on with life. The guy who shot him was found not guilty, so says the grand jury. We have a no bill. He was arraigned for murder and he was not indicted. Negroes pushed the case. Now, to date, I have not found another case, an earlier case in Florida history where a group or a community of black farmers got together and said, you've crossed the line. No more. You can't just shoot us and keep going and call it justifiable homicide. So this, for me, was huge. What kind of man was A.S.J. Allen? What in the world? Because if you push back in 1904, you can get your house burned down, you can have your property destroyed, you can have your crops burned. I mean, all sorts of retaliation. And I'm thinking, what kind of person was this that would embolden people to the point that they would say, you know, I'm going to risk it. This was not right, and I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say no. And that is really why I started doing this work. That it was, a piece of it was because I wanted to know my own history and satisfy that own grief that I was experiencing. But from the very beginning, it was about something bigger. It was about community, because my great-grandfather understood living in community with people. And he built enough social capital in his community, in his life, that people were willing to stand up for him after his death. And I just thought that that was honorable. Carter G. Woodson's, one of his more famous quotes, those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. I gained that inspiration through this process. And this is just some of the work that I do. I spend a lot of time talking mostly to middle schoolers. I like kids. Middle schoolers, they don't fall asleep on you and they don't talk back most of the time. But middle schoolers are neat because they'll listen, and then I'll get calls or emails in the evening from their parents going, "A child won't shut up. He keeps asking me questions about grandpa and grandma." And it's like, yeah, that's what we want them to do. We want it to go on. So I talked about building that social care capital in A.S.J. Just took a map of Alachua County and looking at all the places that he went. So to understand the travel aspect of A.S.J. Allen, he was ordained in the Methodist Church in 1890. So he, back then, a lot of small communities could not afford a local preacher. So you would essentially rent a preacher. CC writers, circuit county writers in the Methodist Church would sign up, and they would have a church in various small, poor communities over a certain geographic area. So one Sunday, he may be in Stark. The next Sunday, he's in Waldo. Then he'll go down to Jonesville. Then he'll be over here in Trenton. And then he'll come up to High Springs. Then he'll go up to Noonanville. And there was no, oh, that's Reverend Allen's church. He was all over the place. And I found records of him as far north as Jacksonville, all the way south down into Citra area. And then eventually we actually found him in the Tampa, St. Pete. It's Hillsborough County, but the counties have changed a bit. Hillsborough was a lot bigger back then than it is now. But to get an idea of what he was doing, he wasn't just going to these places, preaching a sermon, and then leaving. He stayed there. He was a part of these communities. This is a listing of 30 weddings that this man has performed. 30. And if you've read, what the book, he didn't live to be 40 years old. This is what he did from 1890 to 1904. And it just boggles my mind to think what could have happened had he continued building community and living. But this is A.S.J. Allen. I mentioned the idea that, when I talk to children especially, they're inquisitive, they have questions, they want to know more, and that's so heartwarming for me. But it leads me into Paul's area of expertise, oral history. As we want to do our study, we want to start asking some questions, and there's always that question of where do I start? What do I say? As you go through the book, you're going to see little Post-it notes along the way. And it has a listing of 20 questions. Now, those are not random questions. There is a group at Emory University in Georgia called the Family Narratives Lab. It's run by Marshall Duke and Robin Fivish. I met with them years ago, and we talked about family history and narrative story. What Marshall and Robin did was they came up with this thing called the Do You Know scale. And it's a list of 20 questions that it's on my website, it's in the book, but essentially these are questions that are great for you to ask and answer yourself, but especially the younger people in your lives, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Questions like, do you know how your parents met? Do you know where your mother grew up? Do you know the source of your name? Do you know which person in the family you look like the most? And what you do is you just answer yes or no to all the questions. At the end, you count up your yeses. And what the researchers found at the Family Narratives Lab was that they did this for years. What they found after compiling all of their data was that the children, the adolescents who scored higher on the Do You Know scale actually performed better in life. It makes a difference if a person is grounded and knows who they are, whose they are, and where they came from. It makes a tremendous difference. So I'm a big advocate of the 20 questions and us being able to answer them ourselves and having our children, being the younger people in our lives, to know those answers. Just some of what the research has shown us is that when you have adolescents who know the answers to these questions, we're talking less school absences, higher academic achievement, higher graduation rates, higher college attendance. If you go out on the LA Police Department, they have stats on looking at the lower rates of criminal behavior, disruptive behavior, and even arrest rates among populations who are in touch with their family history. When you have this in you, It is so very important, and I can't preach that one enough. But as you go through the book, you will see those 20 questions popping up all over. As you go through and you start getting into this mode of, okay, I see what A.S.J. Allen's about, and I'm starting to dig into my family, you're going to hit a couple roadblocks, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of those, because the very first one you're going to hit is time. Some of you have already fallen into the trap. You stayed up all night last night reading my book. I heard about it. Okay? This stuff is addictive. I should have warned you earlier, but okay? Once you start down the road of researching, you're going to find it is quite time-consuming. And I actually say that seriously as sort of a disclaimer, because I believe our culture and the media especially don't do a good job of saying that. We watch one of the many shows on television where people are finding their roots and discovering their history. And, you know, it's a 30-minute show. You've had a couple runs to the bathroom, a couple cups of coffee, and, you know, 30 minutes later, man, there's your book of life. What people don't understand is it took an army of researchers about 3 years to produce one episode. It's not an easy, quick thing to do. So just be ready, be prepared. The other thing is you're going to come across literacy issues, spelling, as I like to say. For those of you that I've shared with before, just in my own family history, my family name is Lembric, L-E-M-B-R-I-C. To date, I've found 11 variations of Lembric. Go figure. Literacy is a big thing in our society. For our ancestors, not so much. You know, it was not a typewritten world. It was not a world of the printed page. It was a world of oral tradition, and your name would be written many different ways by the same person. Dot and I have been out to Mount Nebo, to the cemetery, and you go out there and you start looking at the Lembric tombstones, and you will see family members, siblings, buried next to each other, and the names are spelled differently. And it's like, okay, did they not know? Did they care? Really? Honestly, no, they didn't. So that's one of our issues. It wasn't theirs. Attitudes. What I mean by attitudes, we'll get to attitudes. Attitudes come up, and then due diligence. So it takes a while. Spelling is an issue. We like things that are written in stone. Nothing is written in stone. And as I spoke earlier this week to the group over in the Hilton, I don't think that the spelling issues are really just a census issue and finding the wrong spellings there and the inconsistencies in letters and newspapers. Those will not be the things that will cause our great-grandchildren to not find us. I think the spelling issues are firmly in the hands of the people who sell us products. My name is Alonzo. I went to the store. All I wanted was a cup of coffee. I got to the end of the counter, and the guy yelled out, "Latanto?" Seriously. So I have more patience with census takers and, you know, official documents when someone face to face calls me Latanto after I've said Alonzo 2 or 3 times. Yeah, it happens. Attitudes. I said I'd wait on that one. I mentioned at the very beginning When I tried to find out about A.S.J. Allen from my grandmother, from my great aunts and uncles, I got nothing. And it was a while before I realized I got nothing because of trauma. His death was a violent dying, and because it was a violent dying, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't have the benefit of counseling. You know, today a shooting happens and the counselors come in. In 1904, the shooting happened and nobody came in to talk to the family. So they're trying to process what this means and how do I survive and how do I move forward and what do I do? And honestly, my grandmother, I can speak for her because she raised me, her way of dealing with trauma was to be quiet. That was a pattern I saw in her life as I grew up in her house. So you have stories about slavery, incarceration, incest, all sorts of family, skeletons, and you'll get questions like, well, why are you digging that up? What's the deal? Why do we have to talk about that? I work a lot with adoptees, people who they have no clue who their biological family is, and finding answers, it can be like trying to go through the witness protection files and, discover these people because they don't want to be found many times. And sometimes finding them can be painful. One particular incident, the fellow found his biological mom. She stood at the front door, and this is an exact quote, "If I had known it would come looking for me, I would have aborted." She just didn't want to be found. And I think, it's heartbreaking, it feels bad, and at the same time, I feel like I need to respect and honor, her and people who may feel this way. So as you're going through looking for answers, you may hit a brick wall. Don't push. Do not push on the brick wall. Now, if it's a wall you can get around, absolutely, let's get together, let's talk, and let's make it happen. But there's some walls you'll hit, you should just leave them there. Because we're not just talking about data. And I like to tell my kids this when we're talking about doing some oral histories and talking to people. When I come to you and I want to ask you, say as an elder, can you tell me about so-and-so? For me, it's collecting data. For them, it's talking about a friend. It's talking about someone they knew and loved. And when you're in that kind of a scenario, you don't want to push that wall. You want to be able to say, this was a horrible event, it hurt. If you ever feel like talking about it, let's get back together. But don't, I've seen too many cases where interviews are cut short and communications are broken because we push when we really shouldn't. Mama wasn't good enough, so you had to go looking for them. That was another quote from a woman I helped who was an adoptee, and that was what her brother said when she said, I want to find my biological family. It can cause some friction. So you just want to be aware of things like that. Also along the lines of attitudes, we talk about bad actors and infamous ancestors and just plain honestly uncomfortable truths. Okay, we live in the United States of America. We have been a racially divided country since its inception. So if you're black, there's probably a history. Not always. There's probably a history of slavery in your family. If you're white, there's probably a history of slave ownership in your family. Nothing you can do about it. It's not your fault, but it's there, so let's talk about it. But you will run into family members who will not want to discuss it, and it gets really uncomfortable. We look at I don't know how many of you are aware of the Ben Affleck moment on Finding Your Roots. Let's don't talk about that, when Dr. Henry Louis Gates confronted him with his slave-owning ancestors. End of the show. We're not gonna go down that road. We all see these historical postcards and pictures of, you know, people being hanged and their children in these pictures. You know, these things happened in full view. They're picnics. They're a part of our history. But see, what people get a little squeamish about is, you know, this little girl standing here, that's somebody's grandma. And she doesn't really want her grandchildren to know that I was there when they hung Joe. She doesn't want to talk about that. So, you know, we have snatch and grabs and riots and all sorts of things going on today. Everybody's got a camera. We're taking pictures of it. 2 or 3 generations from now, what happens when Jimmy goes, "Is that Uncle Joe?" He may not want to talk about it. So I love history, but I always want to look at history from the point of view of the humanity. It's about people. And as we discuss history, it's so important to keep the humanity in there. Just one other brief thing about biases and attitudes. Being Black in America has always made the press nervous. When I was growing up as a child, I remember my mom took 2 newspapers. The St. Pete Times came in the morning, the Evening Independent came in the evening. And whenever there was a crime, Mom would always comment on knowing the race of the person who committed the crime. Because if the headline says, "Man robbed 7-Eleven," he was white. But when the headline said, "Negro robs 7-Eleven," there's no doubt. And that tradition goes back a long way, a long way. 1902, Ocala Evening Star. Patrolman tried to arrest Jim McPhee, a bad Negro. Jim will probably die. 1905, Sam Bass, a bad nigger, was shot by Tampa police on Monday while trying to resist arrest. And it would just sort of come out in the newspaper of, here's what we think of you. So as you're doing your research, be thick-skinned. Know that you're going to learn history about real people, and ugly things will be said. It's not okay, but it is. It just is. So be ready for that. My final example on that, this is a 1860 census, Calhoun County. Anybody know, been out in the Panhandle area? I was sharing with a woman at the conference, and she goes, "You've got relatives from there? Oh, those are some rough people." And it's like, yep, that's my folks. The 1860 Calhoun County, Florida census. They come across the little area where my folks are living, and the census writer, you know, from the previous slide, you can see he took down everybody's info, and then I don't know, he's bored or what, but he decided to just write a little, you know, while I eat my sandwich here, let me tell you what I think about these people. Well, the free Negroes of this county are a mixed-blooded, almost white. They've intermarried with a case of low-class white and have no trade, occupation, or profession. They live in a settlement or town of their own, and personal property consists of hogs and cattle. They make no produce except for corn and peas and very little of that. They're a lazy, indolent, and worthless race. Thank you very much, John G. Smith. As you do your discovery, it will keep you up at night. You will run into bias. You will get angry. You will get sad. So this is what it's like to do this. This was a great journey. And I hope you enjoy reading about it. I hope you can use it to do your own research. But no, these things are going to happen to you. You will find things about, you will find people you don't know saying things about your family, and you're going to want to throw the book down. It's okay. Let the book hit the wall, pick it up later, and go back and keep working. We talked a little bit earlier about the variation of news reports. I'm not going to really go through that. What I do want to encourage you, and what I encourage you in the book, is what I call due diligence. Look everywhere. Most of the time, we like to stick with the top. Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, Family Search. And we think, oh, I've done my research. I've hit the top 3. There are scores of other resources for you to find your family history. So look through in the book, I list out many of them. Look through them all, and as you look under every rock, don't forget or be afraid to look under those rocks of Cindy's list of prisons, prisoners, and outlaws. Don't be afraid to look under those criminal records category in Ancestry. Black sheep ancestors. You will find, I have found my ancestors as inmates in Florida correctional institutions, in asylums. You will find jail records. We have, I've got relatives that in my family scrapbook, the only pictures I have of them are their shots from the online Florida inmate population. It is what it is. But so many times I talk with folks and they're doing their family history search, but they're not looking everywhere. We're human. We make mistakes. We do bad and horrible things. So do the rest of our family members. Let's seek them out, because that's what family does. The last part of the book talks about working folks, because they had to make a living. They had to do something. Working folks is a really interesting, was an interesting piece for me, because if you think it through, our ancestors identified with their occupations far more than we currently do. In fact, as recently as when I was on campus in the 1970s and 80s, here at University of Florida, you meet someone for the first time, and what's the first question you ask? What do you do? I mean, it was so common. Working with millennials the last couple of years at Duke University, I didn't hear that question. Sometimes people could care less about what you do. It is not an identity marker. But for your ancestors, it was. So much so that, let's face it, where do you think Carpenter, Weaver, Smith, Taylor, family names? They were occupations. That's what those people did, and they identified with it, and it just kept rolling. So, we're talking about working folks, because working folks, when you start looking at your ancestors' jobs, you learn more about them. You will find them in their guild directories, in publications that particular profession published. I found a lot about A.S.J. Allen by going to the Southern Advocate newspaper. It's the Methodist Church's magazine. Well, I would have never thought to look there, but when I did, just about every issue, guess who's mentioned? Great-grandpa. So pay attention to the occupations that your family members had and look to see where they are. In the book, you'll find that I spend a lot of time talking about occupations you will see on census and other records of jobs that no longer exist. So you'll come across names and you'll think, wow, that makes no sense. Like, what's a pin setter? There used to be little boys that were hired to set up the bowling pins once you knock them down because there was no machine to do it. I am old enough to remember that there used to be a milkman who came by the house. They don't do that anymore. my grandmother graduated out of Cookman Institute and was on her way to becoming a computer. And no, not one of these, but a person. She was a mathematician extraordinaire, and she and all her little gray-haired buddies were all very well educated in mathematics and science, but computers was an actual job title. There were town criers, you know, and this just wasn't the guy who got drunk on Saturday night and, you know, yelled at everybody walking by. That was his job, to tell you news. So pay attention to the things that your ancestors did. Pay attention, because the soft science of this is occupations, vocations. There are tendencies that run in families. And I find this so often. One of my exercises that I love doing is someone will approach me about doing a family tree, and I'll do their family tree, and I'll put their name, the birth date, the death date, and then I'll put in the vocation or occupation. And what's really fun is you strip away the name, and you see that, lawyers tend to produce more lawyers. Teachers tend to produce more teachers. Cooks and people who are nurturing, nurses and caregivers, tend to produce more nurturing caregivers. These kinds of things kind of run in a pattern along family lines. And that's good to know when you're talking to kids and they're trying to figure out who they are and what they may want to be. There may be something built in that you might be pretty good at that you just hadn't really considered. So it runs in the family. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Great quote from Mark Twain, and I always, when I hear it, I always call to mind that scene, the two scenes from Forrest Gump, where Bubba talks about my mama cooked shrimp, my grandma cooked shrimp, my great-grandma cooked shrimp. You kind of get the idea that shrimp ran in his family, and, you know, maybe you see that, but then you see it on the other side with Lieutenant Dan, you know. He had somebody die in a major war all the way back to the American Revolution. We look at these things and they're funny, and yes, it's Hollywood, but you start looking at your own family tree and you might see that, does kind of rhyme. Might find some of those tendencies in your own family. As you're looking at records, look at U.S. city directories and phone books also. A lot of times we don't think about them as a source for genealogical information. A lot of family story information came to me out of just what we would call the phone book, because back in the day, here's my cousin Bertha. She's got a little C beside her name because the city wanted to make sure you knew she was colored. And she was a maid, and she lived in a house, H, at 2320 Fairfield Avenue. That's a lot of information that's just out there in the city directory. And I know, we're like, really? And I could feel that way, except I still have my University of Florida ID card from when I was a student that clearly has my social security number and birth date and full name on it. Yeah. You know, we've evolved a little. But consider these sources. Consider phone books and things like that. Just a couple slides here talking about some of the names of jobs and occupations. I did spend a bit of time in the book talking about the Underground Railroad and terms that were used in there, because you will find those sometimes on both census records. Someone will tell the enumerator, I'm a conductor, and sometimes the enumerators just didn't know what that meant and they just wrote it down. So you'll see that. I've got a relative who's listed as a train engineer. And I thought, oh, wow, is this Underground Railroad? I mean, what's going on? Turns out a train engineer was the guy who shoveled the coal into the engine. But who knew? So as you're doing your research, go ahead and look in the book and see what those definitions are, because they may mean something different to them than they mean to us. Race and gender had a big impact on jobs. So depending on what race or gender your ancestor was that you're researching, there were certain jobs in places that were off limits. So don't even look there for them, because it just, no Irish need apply. In 1845, when the potato famine hit and you started seeing a lot of immigration coming in from Ireland, the pushback was horrendous. And you'll find all sorts of jobs that you may want to go, oh, I'll look in the guild here of this particular profession. They're not there. Or you have a profession that you think, oh, my great-great-grandmother was a nurse. Well, you may not find a whole lot about her in the AMA publications. So just be aware of the fact that race and gender played a lot into the kinds of jobs that our ancestors had. The book ends up with dead folk, because that's how we got to have ancestors. Ancestors got sick. Ancestors died. And as you look at death records, you're going to see some things that just make no sense at all. Anybody know what consumption is? It took me years to figure that one out. And I kept going through these records going, consumption, it's like, what? Did she eat herself to death? I mean, what does this mean? And yes, it's TB. Our ancient ancestors died of some, what we would consider curable and common things. And what you look for as you're finding these death records, look for clumps and clusters, because infectious diseases were not controlled then like they are now. So you may find a whole family unit that's wiped out in a very short period of time, and it's because they all just passed it from around to each other. So as you're seeing the data, go back to what I said earlier. This is about people. These are human beings who lived and breathed on each other. And I can see all of you with mass giggling. We don't do that anymore. So places to look, 9 primary records in dealing with our dead. The state keeps death certificates, their local death records, there's a registry, cemetery records, mortality schedule on the census. Churches tend to have death records in their possession, probate records, obituaries and newspapers, and burial permits. Because as we move along in history, you didn't just put somebody in the backyard. You had to get a permit. So there are places to look to actually find those records for folks. So I'm going to end there. There's a whole lot more I could do in talking about some of the diseases that we don't hear a lot about anymore. One of my favorite one is Drapetomania. It's a Negro disease from the mid-1800s. It's a mental illness that made enslaved people desire to run away. This is real. So be aware. There are things out there, there are discoveries, wonders that you will find as you do your research. Enjoy it. Embrace it, enjoy it. It's going to be fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Felder. Wasn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Yes. So, before we go to the book signing, I do want to just give a couple minutes to ask any questions, if you have any questions for Mr. Felder. Yes.
Hi.
One from the corner room. I find, this is the second time I listen to you, and I find your research and your work just fascinating.
Thank you.
I love Black history. But it's kind of ironic to me that at a time when a lot of us are seeking more information around our ancestry, we get all these Dr. Ortiz, we get all these CRT laws that are nothing but the truth. I just find that ironic.
Yes.
And it seems like to me that the reverse effect might be for us to want to learn more about what was going on than less. I just kind of like to know your Dr. Ortiz thought on that.
The way that I've tried to approach all of my work is facts are facts. The data is what it is. I've sort of said that a couple times here. And I try not to get married to what I'm finding because that doesn't accomplish a whole lot. At the very beginning, I had the slide up there of the Sankofa bird of, you go back and get what's important. I really believe firmly in that idea of looking back to move forward. If you started reading, you'll see I start off in the very beginning with just the idea of a rowboat. I grew up, like I said, down in St. Pete. And when you want to get from one side of the lake to the other, I always sit backwards. I sit in the boat backwards. I have a tree or a marker, and I row in order to get there. It's sort of natural for me in my thinking to understand that I'm here and everything I am is a result of the people who came before me. My past, it's not something I wallow in. It's not something I sit around with a lot of nostalgia and romanticize about, but I can't deny it. And I don't always understand maybe the academic argument with CRT and why it's such a bad thing and why people need to be protected from it. I tend to look at life as these are the people who created me and made me. And you ever try to take the tomatoes out of Prego? It's in the stew. So I can't just close my eyes and say, well, it's not really in there. It's in there. So acknowledge it. Paul, I don't know if you...
Well, I think that I blame you, Alonzo, for all these anti-CRT laws.
Okay.
Because you're telling the truth. And the more people now are doing this work, Carol's doing this work at the museum. We have these great, the Alachua County Remembrance Committees doing this incredible work honoring Reverend A.S.J. Allen and others. This is what the people in power are responding to. They don't want us getting together and learning each other's histories, especially critical race theories created by Black women. Yeah. They don't want us listening to powerful, highly educated Black women teaching us about concepts like intersectionality, like how our histories come together. They want us separated. They want us divided. That's what they're afraid of. You're bringing us together.
I'd like to just comment a little bit on that. One of the things that we can do is to preserve, build, and create historical places so that we are able to teach our history outside of the classroom. I think that's more important that we do that. Places like A. Quinn Jones, this is the only place you could do something like this, or other institutions like the Matheson. So we have the latitude to really get into really neat issues and tell the truth without being censored, because they haven't got to local government yet.
I happen to be a part of a family where, going back to the census, we show that every time we have a family reunion. So that's my interest in it.
Okay, so you just mentioned, you triggered something in me. Back to the research that the folks down at Emory are doing, they look very carefully at cultural storytelling within families, and they spend a lot of time talking about oscillating stories. So if, I don't know what the makeup in the room here is, but if you are of a Jewish heritage, then you will immediately relate to what I'm talking about. Every year there's Passover, and you have a Seder. What do you do at Seder? You know, let's talk about critical race theory. You sit there and you learn that we were slaves. You learn that we were at the bottom of the social ladder. It was horrible. And along comes this man who liberates us, who sets us free, and every year we recognize this meal to talk about our liberation and our freedom, and to remember we treat people with equity because we remember we used to be slaves in Egypt. And I think so much of this whole idea of don't talk about it just comes from people who don't have a tradition of families who talk about it. Because when you grow up as a child in a tradition where you learn, we had nothing. We had no pot and no window to throw it out of. And then we moved to Fifth Avenue. And then we lost it all the next generation. And then and you have this oscillating story of your family. When that happens, and your teenage daughter doesn't get invited or get to go to the prom with the boy she wanted to, she's not going to take a mouthful of pills because her life is over because she didn't get to go to the prom. She's got a point of reference that says, you know, we've been through crap. Stuff has happened, and Grandma got through it. I can get through it. And I think that is important for us. Another reason why we need to study history, so that we can have that oscillating story.
So thank you so much.
Alrighty.
Thank you. Again, in the line of history, this is a historic house. So please take a look at some of the exhibitions that are up throughout the house. We have the oral histories. Lincoln High School and A.L. Mabane has some of the best teachers in this county. So you get to listen to some of their stories, hear them speak. Also, we invite you back for our next engagement on June 27th. We're going to get into a real sensitive topic, which is heirs, property, and generational wealth. How African Americans have historically lost their land. And we're working with the Alachua County Property Appraiser's Office to really talk about what happened in this country, in the state of Florida, in Alachua County, and then we're going to try to work to help these families. So that's coming up in June. Please like us on Facebook. We do have some refreshments, and Mr. Felder will be up front signing some books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.